Very nice. And thank you, Mr. Hong or Ms. Goggy for the work that was done on this. Done.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hamel.
Good afternoon.
Trust you are well fed and watered.
I am ready to go.
Well, the well
Canada's finest.
part.
With any luck. Are we ready to proceed?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so you'll recall when we left, where we left off, we were talking about reliable benchmarks and the time periods. And I believe it was yesterday, but perhaps also today, you testified that you were told not to look in the work papers. Do you recall that?
If that is not my testimony, if I said that, that was a mistake. I looked at the work papers.
Okay, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I was writing this out as you were saying it. But I thought you testified today that Hutchings and Stiglitz told you not to look at the work papers with respect to the time periods and them lacking a reliable benchmark.
I do recall a very confused statement that I made in that regard. Can I try to restate it? First of all, I had access to the work papers and looked at all of it and reviewed it. When I read the initial report of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings, I saw the concept of rents with hydroelectricity and calculations that were made. And there was discussion about, in that report, about it being, I don't know the exact words, but it could have been collected or not. That concept is clearly part of their report. But then when I looked at their work papers, I saw the description of the analysis in the work papers, which to me was characterized as those water rentals that could have been collected. That's how I interpreted the work papers themselves, the written material, headings, all sorts of pieces of the work paper had that framework. And
Okay.
so in my initial report, I wrote the analysis. I wrote in my report that they were, they mentioned it was not, I could find the reference, but that they may or may not be collected. But I will review the analysis from the perspective of what I see the work papers to be, which is that they were being collected. So I've made it clear that it could be interpreted both ways, but in my analysis, I would look at it as if those numbers were collected. And I did it for my interpretation of the work papers, and also because in my view, particularly at that point in time, for something to be net Crown resource revenues, it has to be a Crown revenue. So to fit the definition, it would only be applicable as Crown revenues.
Thank you. And that was the same for your economic rents analysis?
This was the economic rents analysis. And then
Okay.
that's not a complete answer to the question of the references made. I believe you just said that someone told me not to look at the work papers or something along those lines. But to carry the story forward, after my initial report, I saw the reply report from Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings. And they made it clear that they do not consider it necessary to collect the rents, and they faulted my analysis because I made that assumption. In retrospect, I should have written it as if they collected it and as if they didn't, because it seems to me it has to be one or the other. But what I actually did in my reply report was look at all the arguments that were in my initial report and framed it in the context as if they were not being collected.
Okay.
So the criticisms are still valid, but the framing was different based on what I still believe is two choices that are available based on what Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings are claiming.
Okay. So now I just want to get into I have a few more issues just to telegraph to the court and to you, Mr. Hamel, where I'm going. I'm just going to get into a few further criticisms that you have of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' approach.
Could I just first go back, if you don't mind? Sir, you say the criticisms are still valid. You say you maintain your criticisms.
Right.
notwithstanding the reply to you, which was you assumed that they had been collected.
Right.
And you say, assume they're collected or not, I maintain my criticism of their approach.
That's right.
Okay, thanks.
And I can give a real specific example. if
No,
you'd
no,
like.
that's okay. I just wanted.
Yep.
So in your mind, they're still valid, is all I'm
Yes.
saying. Okay. But they still apply is what you're
That's right.
from you.
Okay, now back onto some criticisms. On your slide deck, page 30, which is exhibit 58, or for former exhibit S. You say in the fourth bullet point, while they seem to have abandoned this claim, in their first report, they assert such a fee would be well within the margin of what the Crown could have collected without distorting incentives for investment or development. Now, I'm going to put to you that Mr. Hutchings and Professor Stiglitz have not abandoned this claim.
Okay.
And I'm going to put it to you that in their report, and well, their evidence is that in their evidence, they've responded to this. Your concern. Would you agree or disagree?
I disagree. I don't recall that. I disagree.
Okay. All right. So another criticism from yesterday was from you was that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings used actual NCRRs for the period 1999 to 2009 in their economic rents analysis, and you saw that as a flaw.
No, first of all, did you mean to say through 2019?
Oh, if I said 2009, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
I saw that as an opportunity to talk about practicality. I accept the net Crown resource revenues, which are part of economic rents. And, I've agreed with Mr. Hutchings with respect to those figures over that time period. And those are economic rents. And that is the numbers that were put forth in the economic rec section by the Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings. So I accept those in that format. What I was talking about is what it says about reliable benchmarks and other factors.
Okay, so did you review the Stiglitz and Hutchings reports to see what their explanation was for using actual NCRRs from that during that period?
Yes, and I quoted them twice in my demonstratives.
And do you recall the evidence, oral evidence of Mr. Hutchings on this issue?
Not specifically, but I watched it.
So you don't recall slide 279 of his slide deck where he explained why he used NCRRs for this period?
I don't recall page 279 from memory. Could we look at it?
That's fair. No, I don't. To be fair to you, it's a graph, and he orally explained in his testimony as to why the graph. He gave some explanation to the graph, but if you don't recall it, that's okay. I was just putting to you that they had an explanation. They did not abandon their economic rents methodology, and that their decision to use NCRRs for that period was a conservatism.
I'm aware that I recall vaguely a graph that matches your description. I recall him discussing it, and also his testimony, his written report touching on this issue. And I referenced some of that this morning.
Okay. But I want to get into an issue, the next issue in your report, which is with respect to your attempts to engage in some treaty interpretation. Now, throughout your report, you engage or you interpret the treaty, the text of the treaty, and the perspectives and the intentions of the parties. Today and yesterday, I'll save for a few moments, I did not hear you testify with respect to those criticisms in your reports that relate to your treaty your interpretation of the treaty. Do you still rely on those as criticisms?
That's a very long statement. I mean, what struck me is you mentioned me testifying about the intentions of the party. I don't recall, and I don't believe if I did, it was a mistake, talking about the intentions of the parties.
Sorry, I don't want to be unfair to you, so maybe let's just go to your report. And if I said intentions, perhaps I meant perspectives of the parties, so I apologize for that. So at paragraph 111 of your report, exhibit 56. Just go to it for a second.
Paragraph 11,
111
111.
on page 44. So we've gone to this paragraph before, so I'm going to just start at your 2 reasons for rejecting the economic framework, which is in the 3rd line from the bottom of paragraph 111.
Mhm.
So you say, I reject it for 2 reasons, and it in this context is being the that there is some greater economic rent. The first being the wording of the treaty. The without incurring loss language only makes sense with respect to the Crown's ability to pay for any augmentation with resource-based revenues it receives. You see that there?
I do.
Okay. So, and then your second criticism with respect to this is at paragraph 112. Second, my rejection of this concept is consistent with the stage 1 partial judgments as amended by the appeal court, which state that revenues are restricted to Crown revenues from the territory and frequently uses the term net Crown resource revenues to reflect that consideration. So my first question is, do you see a distinction between Crown revenues and net Crown resource-based revenues?
I can see a distinction between Crown revenues and net resource-based revenues.
And in your mind, what is the distinction?
A distinction could be, taking this as a isolated question, Crown revenues could include things beyond the net resource-based revenues, such as income taxes.
Okay. All right, so now I want to go to, and I apologize for the moving between various documents. I'd like to go to exhibit 57, which is your SIR reply report. Okay. So again, you repeat the same criticism in paragraph 111. And you say
Where are you reading?
paragraph 7, page 2. And you say that the first issue I raised to rebut the contention that economic rents is the proper basis for assessing increased revenues under the augmentation clause is the language of the treaty. Now, you would agree with me that you aren't an expert in treaty interpretation or an expert ethno-historian or historian.
That's right.
And so your opinion, your interpretation of the treaty and the language of the treaty is your opinion. No, that is not based on the historic record.
It is This is a statement that I use to go forward to do analysis. It is true that it's not based on a complete review of the historical record or anything close to that. I'm not here for that purpose. I'm not here to advise the court about how to interpret the treaty. But in order to do any analysis, we have to come to, I need some sense of what it says. So I am stating what it says and at times looking at different perspectives as to what it might say. And I'm trying to be very clear about it, not to tell the court how to interpret that, but so the court knows what I'm looking at and how I'm interpreting it, so it can consider my evidence.
Thank you. And what I was getting at this paragraph was that this is a fair reflection at paragraph 7 of how you interpret the treaty, and that's the basis for your analysis.
Right.
So you've already said you haven't reviewed the historic documents. Or I believe you've reviewed some of the historic documents.
I've reviewed very little of the historic documents and almost none in the 1850 period. Obviously, during the water rental period, I reviewed documents, but I suspect that's not what you're asking me about.
Correct. So I'd like you to assume that there was some correspondence in 1858, but I'm not going to turn it up. I'd just like to go through a little bit of a hypothetical with you. If a Crown actor, perhaps someone named Mr. Carney, had it in his mind that it wasn't right to give away the resources and maybe it's land, maybe it's whatever the other resource is, at a less than proper fair market value price. And his solution was to make up the price through different government sources. So there's a price that the Crown is charging. The Crown acknowledges that there's the value of what they're selling is actually higher. And the Crown agrees that they should pay the Anishinaabe the true value, and they'll make up the payment between what they actually collect and the true value themselves. The Crown will make that payment. Sorry.
Okay, I believe I followed that, probably not, but I believe I did.
I'm sorry, I'm really not trying to confuse you. Okay, well, I'm gonna suggest to you that that is the exercise that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings engaged in, where they tried to come up with the true value of the resource, be it land, in this case, hydroelectricity, not the value of what the Crown collected. In their opinion, that's a separate issue, a separate analysis.
Okay. Is there a question?
Yeah, I was just suggesting to you that that's what Stiglitz and Hutchings did, and I was wondering if you agreed that that's what they did or disagreed.
They have done an estimate of value, and when it comes to hydroelectricity, it's that which could have been collected. I don't follow the linkage between that and Mr. Carney and memos written at the time in their analysis. If it's part of their report, I did not focus on that.
It wasn't part of their report. It was just a hypothetical to you. I appreciate you haven't read the document. I understand you haven't read very many historic documents, and that's okay. I just wanted to try and understand the basis of your knowledge in order to understand how you came to the interpretations of the treaty and the perspectives of the parties that are in your expressed in your report. So that's fine. I can move on. So all right. So now if we can just turn the page over to paragraph 10 of your SIR reply report. I know I've referred to you wading into the perspectives of the parties, so I wanted to be fair to you and show you that that is indeed one of the considerations in your analysis at paragraph 10, where you say, in weighing the possible interpretations of the treaty referencing either actual crown revenues or total economic rents for the application of the augmentation clause, one should consider the perspectives of the parties at the time the treaty was signed. Now, what did you look at to consider the perspective of the parties at the time the treaty was signed?
Well, this is a statement about what I consider what one should do. And it is, you know, and I'm referencing as I go on in the next sentence, report of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings. So I use this framework to evaluate what they did and didn't do and how their basis they provided in their report.
So in order to evaluate what they did and didn't do, did you consider the perspectives of the parties at the time the treaty was signed?
I did not, consider is a broad word. I did not review materials to form an opinion about the intentions or perspectives of the party at the time. I looked carefully at the basis that what I saw in the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Hutchings for their conclusions.
She said you left off at I looked.
I looked carefully at the basis.
I look carefully at the bases of, in the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings about their conclusion of looking to total economic rents. And I looked for their review or evidence that this was the perspective of the parties at the time. And I didn't find it there.
You didn't find, could you please repeat that?
I reviewed the conclusions of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings and regarding the use of total economic rents, which they do reference as being, and we could find the reference as making sense, economic sense, or rational parties would view things in a certain way. So they provided an economic framework of how they thought parties should view the circumstance. And then I looked to see if they found any evidence of that. I considered whether they brought in evidence that this was practiced in the industry, that this was done anywhere else at the time, where the parties had any concept of collecting total economic rents on things. Obviously, hydroelectricity wasn't invented yet, but similar products, or whether there was evidence after this was signed that Canada or the Crown was implementing this, calculating economic rents or anything like that. So I went looking in their report for any contemporaneous evidence that anyone was looking at it with this perspective, and I did not find it in their report.
Do you understand that they took an economic interpretation or an applied economic theory to interpreting the augmentation clause in the treaty?
Yes, they brought in their perspective today on what they think people would have looked at it back then. And as far as I can tell, it was based on assumptions about, as I have one demonstrative, you know, people would be concerned about biased collection of water rentals. Therefore, on that basis, we should include total economic rents. And there's quotes in their report to that effect. And they talk about the sense that no one would do that, a rational party would not do that, which I found surprising because I think rational parties do similar things like that today. I've been party to engagements where you rely on others and trust that they come up with a reasonable framework, take reasonable actions that will be reflected in how much you get paid without having full control over that. So it's a convoluted sentence, but I looked for evidence that in their report of contemporary support for this conclusion and didn't find it.
you'll agree with me that one has to look no further than the stage one trial decision and this Ontario Court of Appeal reasons to see why value matters, why the economic rent calculations of or estimations of value matter.
I'm aware that there's references to that in some of the reasons, but that it is not part of the judgment. And I'm aware of that, yes.
So you can find your analysis to what was in the judgment.
That was the primary focus, yes, the judgment. I always try to look at everything that could possibly be relevant. I'm aware of these other documents. I don't rule them out, but I weighed my decision based on the judgment itself.
Okay, so you don't rule out that there could be something helpful in those other documents, in the other historic documents, or in the stage one reasons or the Ontario Court of Appeal reason.
Oh, I think historical documents could very well be important. That's why I called out in my reply report, in my initial report, I made it as clear as I could that I thought this was a gaping hole in the analysis and presentation of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings, expecting to see if I'd missed anything or there was contemporary documents to show this was being implemented, they would provide it as evidence. So I think historical documents can be very important.
You didn't equate the importance of value woven throughout the historical documents and the various court decisions as economic rent. You didn't interpret value like that, or you didn't try to interpret value.
I worked off of the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings and used that as the guide post. Until I saw those reports, I was not expecting anything about economic rents and hadn't considered that that would even be raised in any way in this case. And so when I saw it and their analysis, and especially since it focused on hydroelectric as well as other things, I used that as my entree to this topic and looked at how they drew upon the historical record.
Okay. Just a few more questions. Perhaps we can turn up slide 38 of your exhibit 58, which is your slide deck. Sorry, I forgot to do this. So at slide deck, page 38, under bullet 1, sub bullet 1, if you will, says Mr. Hutchings' characterization of rent as excess profits is helpful. Now, did you base your analysis and conclusions found on this slide, slide 38, and in your the corresponding paragraphs of your report on Hutchings' characterization of rents as excess profit?
No, I didn't base it on that. I found it a useful way to describe it and discuss the term.
Okay, so if we see you've got a citation after you make that statement on slide 38, and you've got it to Hutchings demonstratives, page 265.
Right.
Now, Hutchings demonstratives, I believe, are exhibit 11, and so I've passed up a copy of that page for you. It's a loose leaf paper. Okay, so you can see it there, and at the top you can see it says mining and forestry overview. So you'll agree with me that for mining and forestry, Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings used estimated rents by estimating the excess profit earned by resource firms. You see that there?
I mean, I do see the reference here and I recognize it's relative to mining and forestry too. You've asked me about their calculation and what they did. I haven't looked at that at all.
No, that's fine, but it's fair to say that you took the definition that you've reproduced on slide 38, a little bit out of context.
I don't think so. Mr. Hutchings also talked about excess profits and live testimony. I found this a useful site. I didn't think this would be controversial. It's a common expression I've used myself in talking about rents, excess profit or, yeah, excess profit or extra normal profit.
Okay. All right, so the next bullet on slide 38, sub bullet 2, you say consumers do not pay taxes on this benefit. It is not shared with the Crown. And of course, that's in the context of you talking about uncollected rents largely passed to customers through low electricity prices.
Right.
Right? Okay, so I want to put a hypothetical to you. So let's say a corporation hears through the grapevine that there are low water rental rates in the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory. So they choose to build their biggest factory in the Robinson Superior, or in the world, in the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory. As a result of this factory, there are more jobs, there are more people in the territory eating at restaurants, going shopping, doing all sorts of activity. Would you agree that in that hypothetical, there are increased revenues to the Crown?
Relative to not building that factory?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. If you build the factory, there will be outcomes that could flow to the Crown.
Thank you. Mr. Hamel, thank you for your time today. Those are all my questions.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hamel.
Good afternoon.
I don't know that I've introduced myself to you yet. My name is Spencer Bass. I'm counsel for 7 of the Superior Area First Nations in this case. I have a few questions for you this afternoon, and just to ensure that we're all on the same page, I may be asking you to refer to Exhibit 56, your original expert report, Exhibit 57, your Sir Reply report, and Exhibit 58, your slide deck, your demonstratives. I believe that should be the only documents I asked you to go to, and perhaps 1 or 2 additional ones that we'll put up on the screen. Do you have those with you?
I do.
And actually, the first place that I want to go, because I want to ask you some questions about your qualifications. So I wanted to start with your CV, which is included as the second appendix to your original expert report. Do you have that in front of you?
No. I don't think I have My version of my report does not include my CV, but I'd be willing to work off the screen.
Sure. I don't think it'll be controversial, but at least we can ensure we're all on the same page at the very least.
And where is it?
So it's behind tab 2 of exhibit 56.
Got it,
Which
thank
is the
you.
original report, the larger one. And so I wanted to take a look at, so page 8 of your CV, and note that there are page numbers in the bottom right-hand corner of the CV. So I'm on page 8.
I'm there.
Okay, and starting on this page, you have a heading that's speeches and papers. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, and in this section, you list a number of speeches that you've given and articles that you've written.
Yes.
And it goes on for roughly 5 pages or so to page 12.
Yes.
And Mr. Amal, if I use the term peer reviewed in relation to papers and articles, do you understand what that term means?
Yes.
And am I correct in saying that none of the papers that you list in this section are articles in peer reviewed journals?
That's true.
Thank you. In some of the calculations that you provided, both, I believe both in your report and in your demonstratives, and you spoke about it a bit yesterday, you calculated present values using the long-term bond rate.
Yes.
And I believe you were quite fair, both in your report and in your testimony, that this was done for comparison purposes only.
Yes.
And you're not offering any opinion to this court on the correct or most appropriate method of calculating present values.
That's true.
Doing so would be outside your areas of expertise.
No.
At the very least, it would be outside the areas of expertise that you've been qualified for by this court.
I think that's very true.
You discussed in your testimony that in his NCRR calculations, I might use NCRR as a shorthand, you understand what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah, net crown resource revenues. So in Mr. Hutchings' NCRR calculations for hydroelectricity, he estimates 2% of total revenue should be deducted as expenses.
Yes.
And your ultimate conclusion that you shared with the court yesterday was that this was, quote, not unreasonable.
That's right.
And in your review of the data, you didn't identify any specific expenses that were incurred by the province to support water rental revenues. Is that right?
No, I did not. I did not identify specific accounting records that quantified them, but I did see expenses in the form of surveys and collecting revenues and that sort of thing. But there were activity, but not the quantification and accounting records.
Okay. So maybe we can help clarify that. So you saw indications that there were activities that would lead to expenses.
No. I saw activities that were expenses.
Okay.
To conduct, for example, there were early surveys in the treaty area looking for specifically for hydroelectric potential. So that's an activity that in my mind would be an expense. I did not determine the cost of that, didn't quantify it, but it was an expense.
So in your review, you didn't see the particular quantification, the particular figures of these expenses.
That's right.
Okay, maybe that was the fair way to put it. So thank you for that. And specifically, these figures for these expenses were not listed in the public accounts.
I did not see them there.
And I believe one possible explanation that you shared with us for one reason why particular expenses were not being recorded, at least for some set of those expenses, would be because the water rental revenues were being collected by crown corporations that were self-funding.
The water rentals were collected by the Crown, but the institutions that were making a lot of the investment needed to support hydroelectric, HEPCO in particular, is a self-funding enterprise.
Okay, so to break that down a little bit, HEPCO may be incurring various expenses, but they are covering their own expenses because they're self-funded.
Yes, they certainly are. There certainly are incurring expenses, and that is the mechanism.
And so the provincial government outside of HEPCO is not then incurring additional expenses to do the work that HEPCO is already doing.
The outside of HEPCO, the Crown is incurring expenses, whatever those are. They're not doing the same thing that HEPCO, your formation of your question made it sound like they're doing the same thing. HEPCO is self-funding and can take care of the vast majority of its expenses of that nature. And there may be others, but it's hard to track down.
I think my point was simply that the Crown would not be incurring expenses for various activities that HEPCO is pursuing because those expenses are being incurred and funded by HEPCO.
Right.
Okay. And so as far as you're aware, in his review of the records, Mr. Hutchings didn't identify any particular accounting or figures for expenses either, correct?
That's right.
But nevertheless, he assumes that there should be some expenses, and so he includes his 2% expense rate.
Right. I think it's more than, he recognizes that there were expenses and didn't want, I'm putting words into his mouth, but I realized 0 was the wrong answer. And so he came up with on his own basis for the 2% figure.
And the effect of this assumption on Mr. Hutchings' part would be to bring down his total NCRR figure.
That's right.
And just to put that another way, in effect, his NCRRs for hydroelectricity, they go down from 100% to 98%.
Oh, yes.
And I wanted to ask you a few questions about demand in hydroelectricity now. And during your testimony yesterday, you spoke about, when you were speaking about province-wide water rental revenues, and I think to be fair, you made this point a few times in your testimony, but you noted that water rental revenues might fluctuate from year to year based on more demand by customers.
Yes.
And you made the point that we generate when customers need electricity.
That's right.
And certainly for hydroelectricity, at least that was true up until, at least the 1970s. And then you have other forms of electricity generation making up a more significant portion.
Yes, hydro was primary source of energy up till 1970, then fossil, and ultimately nuclear came on.
And I'm going to return to that topic in a minute, but I want to stay on the issue of demand for right now. And so essentially what you're saying is that the more demand for electricity that there is from customers, the more electricity is generated, which means the more water rental revenues are going to be collected by the government. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes.
And when we're talking about demand for electricity, one factor that would influence demand, and I believe this is the factor that you mentioned fairly often in your testimony, is consumer habits.
Consumer what?
Consumer habits? Habits.
Habits. Pattern, what people do.
Yes.
I don't recall using that term, but demand for electricity is based on choices of consumers.
Yep. You'd agree with that?
Yes,
And another major factor that could influence demand is population. Do you agree with that?
yes,
And to break that down just a little bit more, the more people that are living in a particular geographic area, the more electricity that area is going to need to support those people.
on average, that's true.
Somewhere like the city of Toronto has a lot of people living there. There's going to be a large amount of electricity needs.
That's true, certainly.
By contrast, some remote area where no one lives there, not going to be a lot of electricity needs.
That's true. I mean, mixed in here is industrial activity, and there can be high energy demand with low population. Sometimes our most industrial processes are put in the least populated areas.
Certainly.
That's another factor.
And I'm not suggesting that population is the only factor that would influence demand, but you'd agree that it's at least a factor.
Yes.
And in going through your slides yesterday, I was confused about one of the charts that was on your slide. So I was hoping that you could help me understand it. And so I wanted to take you to slide 28 in your slide deck.
I'm there.
And in the top right hand corner of that slide, you reproduce your figure 19A. Do you see that?
Yes,
And so this figure is entitled Water Rental Revenues and Economic Water Rents in RSD Area. And the second column purports to show the average water rentals. Is that right?
yes,
And so this is the actual average water rental rate that was actually charged and collected by the Crown. Do I have that right?
I realize I was looking at this wrong, but my answer is correct. Yes, that's true.
Okay.
Just let me get that, please. This is the average water rate.
I had put it the actual average water rental rate that was actually charged and collected by the Crown.
Thank you.
And so where were the numbers in this column derived from?
This column with our average water rentals,
Yeah, just that the second column on the chart.
this is derived from calculations that match up with Mr. Hutchings' water rental figures.
Okay. So would it be fair to say both Mr. Hutchings' calculations and from your independent review of the records, you would both be consistent on these numbers?
Yes, I think he would come up with these same numbers based on his NCRR analysis.
Okay. And then if we move over to the next column, which is the average economic water rents, these figures are derived from Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' work.
That's right.
And then the last column that we see in the chart is the average multiplier is what it's called, correct?
That's right.
And so this is meant to show how much greater the economic rent rate is from the actual water rental rate.
That's right.
And so the idea is that if you multiply the water rental rate by the multiplier, you should get the economic rent rate.
Yes.
Okay. And so that's why I was wondering, because if I look at the first row of the table, you'd agree with me that if we take 1 cent, which is the average water rental, and we multiply that by 162, the average multiplier, it doesn't equal $1.30.
Right.
It would actually equal $1.62.
That's right. And so what we're looking at is rounded numbers. All of these numbers, I presume, have digits beyond what's presented on this chart. So that 0.01 could be 0.0099. The 1.30 could be 304. It's just rounding errors.
Okay,
And the rounding up, you say is in the middle column?
Yeah, all of this analysis is based on the full numbers, as Excel will give you however many digits. And then you format it so that you only show two significant figures here.
So you're saying that we're looking at rounded numbers, but the calculations included multiple digits.
Right.
and perhaps I'm still a little bit confused, so perhaps I'll have a few more questions to clarify this. So you didn't calculate the average multiplier here by just taking the average water rent, or I guess by taking the average economic water rent for that period and dividing it by the average water rental for that period.
I did what your words say, but I did it with digits that are more detailed than are presented here.
Okay,
I didn't do it with the figures on this table. I did it with the source numbers that had many more decimal points.
and so that would similarly be the same explanation for why in the second row, if we multiplied 5 cents by 23.7, we don't get $1.23.
Right.
It's the same explanation. for
Yes.
that.
Yes. I could add a little more if you want.
Sure.
It's just when you're dealing with numbers with one significant figure, 0.01 and 0.05, that's just one decimal, the rounding is pretty significant. If you get to numbers that have many more digits, like 337 at the bottom, well, that's a poor choice, but as you have more digits, the rounding is less significance.
I think you may have mentioned $1.23. Oh, I mentioned, okay, I may have said $1.23. What's on the chart is $1.26. So I apologize for any confusion. See, as you may be aware, when you ask lawyers to do math, you can sometimes run into a lot of difficulties.
We were just at the counting part. not the math.
All right, so I'd like to move on. And ask if you'd agree with me that the electricity industry in the province of Ontario has become more complex in the last 2 decades than it was at the start of the 20th century.
I think it's easy to look at it that way, but I wouldn't agree.
Okay.
I've often said, and I've been fascinated with the evolution of this industry, that the early days of this industry were sort of the semiconductor chip technology of the time. We were inventing brand new equipment that hadn't been seen before, and experimenting with all kinds of market structures, dealing with competition and monopoly power, and there's a long history of how complicated things were. It is true that we've gotten more sophisticated in our competitive electricity markets, and we use computers in ways we never did. But I think for the time, it was actually there was a lot going on in that era, in the early years.
I think that's very fair, Mr. Amal, but I want to maybe drill down a little bit deeper on maybe a particular area of complexity that I'm interested in. And so back in let's take the 1920s for an example, there were fewer sources of electricity available than there are today.
Yes.
And you mentioned it earlier, even in some of my questions to you, that electricity generation in Ontario at the outset was almost exclusively from hydroelectricity.
That's right.
And in fact, you say that it was almost exclusively from hydroelectricity up until the 1960s.
That's right.
And so prior to the 1960s, to the extent that there were any alternatives to electricity generation from hydro available, it's probably all fossil fuels. Would I be correct in saying that?
No.
What other alternative sources were available prior to the 1960s.
Well, an alternative to electricity from hydroelectricity, an alternative to hydroelectricity is not using electricity at all.
Right, I'm trying to focus on alternative sources of electricity specifically.
Okay, then ask the question that way, please.
Okay, so prior to the 1960s, as alternative sources of electricity, as an alternative to hydroelectric generation, would the only option have been from fossil fuels?
I believe that's true. It's, well, there may have been an occasional wood generator. They do exist.
And then from the 1960s onwards, alternative sources of electricity started to become more readily available.
Yes,
And those include fossil fuel sources like coal or natural gas.
I thought we had included fossil fuels as an alternative earlier than that.
We had, but after the 1960s, they're becoming even more readily available than they were prior to the 1960s. Or is that not true?
I don't think that's true. The first power plant I mentioned in 1882 was a coal plant.
Okay.
So it's been available.
Okay.
Since the
So
beginning.
fossil fuels were always available as alternative, pre-1960, continue to be so post-1960.
Right.
Okay. But one of the big changes that we do have is nuclear comes online as a potential source of electricity.
That's right.
And then more recently, we have wind power coming on as a possible source of electricity.
That's true.
And in Ontario, we've built a number of wind farms.
That's true.
And nowadays we have solar power as a potential alternative source of electricity as well.
That's true.
And so that brings me back to my earlier question, which is that the electricity market in Ontario today is much more diversified than it was 100 years ago. Maybe diversified is a better term than complex.
Yeah, if I could rephrase that, the generation of the resources used to generate electricity in Ontario are much more diverse than they used to be.
And so compared to the 1930s, the 1940s, if we're looking at it today, it's not as easy to point to a single obvious alternative source of electricity if hydroelectric generation is not used.
There are more choices today.
Right. And that's because now if one wanted to switch away from hydroelectric power, they could rely on fossil fuels, nuclear, or renewable sources like wind or solar.
That's true.
You prepared and provided revised versions of both of your reports, which are both dated April 17th, 2023.
Yes.
You'll agree with me that that's earlier this month.
Yes.
I can at least do that math. We can all agree on that. So I want to take a look at slide 39 of your demonstratives. Just let me know when you get there.
I'm there.
And on slide 39, that's where you make the point that non-HEPCO enterprises don't earn excess profits.
I make the point they could theoretically, but they are unlikely to. They are not earned.
I was going to say, you go a little bit further than
Right.
just not likely to. You say excess profits are not earned.
Right.
And so that's your way of saying that these non-HEPCO enterprises don't capture a portion of the economic rents.
The hypothetical economic rents put forth by Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings aren't captured by these non-HEPCO generators.
And in support of this point on your slides, you cite to paragraphs 33 and 35 of your initial report. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so I want to go to those paragraphs in your report. So if you could pull up your initial expert report.
Sorry, what page, please?
So it starts on page 12.
Thank you.
And I'm looking at paragraph 33, and then I also want to look at paragraph 35, which is on the next page, page 13. And looking at these two paragraphs, and I don't want to necessarily read all of both paragraphs into the record, but please take your time to look through them. And you'd agree that in these paragraphs, you discuss the history of the industry in Ontario?
That's right.
And you'd agree with me that you don't discuss economic rents at all in either of these paragraphs?
Not specifically, no. I talk about HEPCO and the minor share of non-HEPCO units.
And you don't make the point explicitly in either of these paragraphs that excess profits are not earned by non-HEPCO operators?
I lay out the industry structure here and talk about the role and the market prices and how they're set in general. I don't relate this to rents in this paragraph.
Okay. And so my question was, you don't make the point explicitly in either of these paragraphs that excess profits are not earned by non-HEPCO operators.
I don't make that point explicitly here.
Thank you. In your testimony this morning, you took issue with Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' conclusion that a portion of the economic rents are recaptured by the Crown indirectly through routes such as income tax, and to be fair, at least for the hydroelectric industry, which you've been qualified to speak about.
Right.
And in Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' initial report that they prepared, they discussed this concept of indirect rent recapture.
That's right.
All that, and I think it might actually be worthwhile for us to take a look at that. So I'd ask Ms. Lewis if she can pull up the Stiglitz and Hutchings initial report and go to paragraph 70. Do you have a hard copy of the Stiglitz and Hutchings report in front of you as well?
Yes.
Okay. So that's great. You can rely on that. And for the rest of us, Ms. Lewis is going to put it up on the screen. And so at paragraph 70, that's where Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings makes the point that the Crown does recapture some of these transferred rents through generalized taxes like personal and corporate income taxes and sales taxes. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And then if we scroll down to paragraph 80, actually, I'm looking just before paragraph 80. They provide a pie chart illustrating how this concept works. Do you see that?
I do.
And as you testified, you read and reviewed their report,
I did.
and that was prior to preparing your expert reports?
Yes.
And yet, would you agree with me that in either your initial reply report or your SIR reply report, you don't offer any direct response to this argument?
No, I don't agree with that. In the following context. They talk about these issues in general. And then we have the phrase we've talked about a lot, that economic rents can be fully captured through water rentals. So we have two states of the world. We have a state of the world where we aren't collecting in the water rentals, and this may come to play, may or may not. But when we actually go to calculate water rentals under the analysis that they did, and that's the full capture, these issues no longer apply. I did that in my initial report, as I talked about, assuming that those were collected. I showed in my reply report where even if they weren't collected, the analysis would be the same and the issues with that calculation would be the same. And so if all the water rental rents are collected through if all the water rents are collected through a water rental payment, either calculated or actual, then there is no excess. So this does not apply. And it is in the live testimony of Professor Stiglitz, we made clear this other element, and that's what I responded to in my demonstratives today.
In Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings' initial report, they make the point directly, and I just took you there, that a portion of the economic rents are recaptured by the Crown through indirect means such as taxes. You'd agree with me there?
Yes.
And nowhere in your reports, either your initial report or your SIR reply report, do you directly respond to or criticize that argument that a portion of the economic rents are recaptured through taxes. Do you agree or disagree?
I agree because I only focus on hydroelectricity.
Okay.
And hydroelectricity, that didn't play a role in their analysis, so I did not address it.
Okay. And so let's go to slides 40 and 41 of your slide deck. Would you agree that these slides contain your response to this argument?
This is in response to those arguments, yes.
Okay. And if we look through slides 40 and 41, the only reference that I see to any of your reports, whether it's your initial report or your SIR reply report, is a reference to paragraph 111 and paragraph 113. And please take your time to look through it.
Which two pages, please?
40 and 41.
Okay. That's right.
And so let's return then to your initial expert report and let's go to paragraphs 111 and 113. And please take your time to review those paragraphs, but would you agree with me that in neither of these paragraphs do you specifically address the idea that the Crown recaptures some rents indirectly through taxes?
I don't mention it there, but I want to point out that I'm responding in part to Professor Stiglitz's live testimony. And I referenced that day 4.
Okay.
And so part of this response is drawing on paragraphs 111 and 113 in my report and additional response to the live testimony of Professor Stiglitz.
Although you already agreed with me that Professor Stiglitz and Mr. Hutchings makes this point about what I call economic rent recapture in their initial report.
Right, but it is in live testimony where he talked about it specific to the electricity industry.
Okay.
In the earlier, as I mentioned, because of the way they framed their economic rents for hydro, they assumed it was entirely collected there. And it was in live testimony that Professor Stiglitz talked about a manufacturing firm, for example.
And looking again at paragraph 111 and 113, you'd agree with me that you don't state in either of those paragraphs that uncollected rents are unlikely to be excess profit to any entity.
It doesn't talk about unlikely to be excess profits. It's issued more generally.
Okay, thank you. Hoping to only have about 5 to 10 minutes left, Your Honor, so
Why don't we do it then?
I propose to go through it and hopefully we can all get on our way pretty soon. So actually, let's stick in your initial report. And I want to go to paragraph 116, now 116. And so you've made this point in your oral testimony before this court, but I think it might be helpful to look at the language that you use in paragraph 116. And this is where you express the view that there's no evidence that the Crown purposefully depressed water rental rates as a way of reducing payments under the treaty. Do you see that?
I think that's a mischaracterization. I say there's no evidence is presented in the reports of Professor Stiglitz and Hutchings.
Okay, that's a fair clarification. So thank you for that. And then you go on to say at the end of the paragraph that you see no reason to conclude that the water rental rates were purposefully depressed out of consideration of these treaties.
Right.
Nevertheless, if we move on to paragraph 122 of your report, you do say at the start of that paragraph, turning specifically to hydroelectricity and water rental rates, the rates were purposefully set low.
Yes.
And then you go on to discuss how this was the government policy since at least 1858.
1898 is.
1898.
And it's a marker in time. I believe it's since then, but I'm not stating that covers every year, but I believe that's true. But the set low here is a very different characterization than what is talked about being set low. In
We'll get to that.
116.
We'll get to that in a second. But the point that I wanted to raise is that you do say that they were purposely set low. You talk about it being government policy since at least 1898. And you also note that keeping the cost of electricity low was a, quote, major driver in the establishment of HEPCO.
Yes.
And so you'd agree that it's not just a theoretical possibility that the Crown could purposely set water rental rates lower than they could, but this is what they actually did.
That seems to be a nonsensical tautology. It's lower than it could have been. Everything's lower than it could have been, and they purposely made it lower than it could have been.
Okay, well, so let's dig into that then. When you say that the rates were purposely set low, what do you mean by purposely set low? Do you mean lower than the market rate?
No, there's no market rate that I know of for water rentals. They were set relatively low and consistent with the quote in my demonstratives from 1898 that we talked about. So they are low. It could have been higher.
Okay. They were low, they could have been higher. And so I think this goes to the point that you were trying to make a little bit earlier. Regardless of the reason why, the Crown did purposely set water rental rates low.
Well, there were reasons why they said it. Those reasons did not include, as far as paragraph 116 in my testimony discusses, and to the extent that I'm aware of, they weren't set low out of consideration of the treaty, but they were set low for other reasons.
Regardless of what their reasons were, the Crown set water rental rates low.
They set the rates low.
Thank you. And the result of such a policy would be less revenues to the government than they otherwise could have collected from water rental rates.
That's true.
And so the result of that, if we rely only on a net Crown resource revenue approach as the basis for the augmentation clause in the treaty, would result in a lower level of compensation to the Anishinaabe. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't talk about compensation to the Anishinaabe at all. There's an augmentation clause. I talk about how this might be relevant to that, but what's done with those numbers is outside of my scope.
So you have no comments on how this government policy might impact compensation to the Anishinaabe under the augmentation clause.
I just want to stay clear from any pretense and giving any indication that I've looked at actual compensation. Clearly, there's an augmentation clause. The more money that is considered in the augmentation clause factored into thinking about how much might be compensated and paid to the Anishinaabe. But I'm drawing a bright line there because that's not something I get involved with.
Do you agree at least if compensation under the augmentation clause is based off of net Crown resource revenues and net Crown resource revenues are lower, compensation would be lower? Or you won't even go that far?
I won't go that far. Based on could mean a lot of different things, and I do not have an opinion on that.
I only have one more area that I wanted to ask you about, Mr. Hamal, and it should likely be fairly brief. You're not a lawyer?
No,
You don't have any legal training,
no formal legal training.
formal legal training? You don't have a law degree?
No.
And so if we go to paragraph 112 of your report. This is where you discuss your second reason for your rejection of this concept, the concept being economic rents.
Yes.
And you say second.
No,
my-
no, I'm sorry.
Oh.
It's some greater value of economic rates greater than the NCRR.
Okay, fair enough. And you say that your second reason for your rejection of this concept is consistent with the stage one partial judgments as amended by the appeal court, which states that revenues are, quote, restricted to Crown revenues from the territory, and frequently uses the term, quote, net Crown resource-based revenues to reflect that consideration. Those are your words?
Yes.
And given your lack of formal legal training that we just discussed, you'd agree with me that you don't have any particular expertise to provide a legal assessment or an interpretation of a decision or judgment from a court of law in this country?
I do not have the legal background to provide a legal opinion about what it means. That's true. And I'm not doing that here. And if it's reading that way, then I've written it poorly. I need to make assumptions for any analysis that I do. I understand this court will need to make these final determinations, and I seek to provide clarity. I consider a range of options. Among those are things that I think make sense as a layperson reading the language. And I consider multiple interpretations
Okay.
at times.
And to follow up on that answer, you would accept that questions of the proper interpretation of both the augmentation clause in the Robinson Superior Treaty, as well as the proper import of the Court of Appeals directions in their judgment is a matter for the court and the judge in this case to decide.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamal. Those are my questions for you.
Thank you. Mr. Hamal, thank you very much for your contribution to this case.
I believe Ontario does have some.
Oh, I'm
redirects,
so
just before you
sorry.
Dismiss the witness.
I'm so sorry. Mr. Hong,
Maybe I should ask, Mr. Ma, we've been going for quite some time. Do you need a health break, anything? Should I-
I'm fine.
There is a light at the end of the tunnel. I'll be very brief. I only have 2 areas to go at, and so let's start with the first one. There was a quick exchange before lunch between the court, yourself, and my friend about the hypothetical. So I'm going to bring up the rough transcripts from 12:39 of today. Okay, you see that in front of you, sir?
I do.
At 12:39, the court asked, and when I read this, that is what the hypothetical person was expressing. The rates go up, demand goes down. I didn't think that this hypothetical would be an argument about that. I thought you were telling me that this was a truism. And then you respond, it is. It goes down. It's so often the problem in these discussions is where our starting point is, and I can move past this. I agree with you that there is a reduction in demand, but for there to be less revenue overall, this has to be enough reduction to offset. Can you just explain that last sentence? But for there to be less revenue overall, this has to be enough reduction to offset.
Right. And I'm going to try to do this without finding the example, but as I recall, with the water rental rate went from $1 to $10. And if we started with the water rental rate at $10, we would find, really want to pull this up.
Isn't the,
There's a water rental rate of $1 and then it goes up to 10. And it's true, increasing the price causes the amount consumed to go down. Consumers respond to price. My reaction was to the exact wording of this. And the hydro expert exclaimed, stop. If you charge $10 for hydro, the demand is going to change and there will be less revenues. Less revenues is an absolute, that's a total quantum. If we increase the rate by 10, from 1 to 10, then we'll get 10 times more revenues if there's no change in demand. If we have a substantial change in demand, rather than get 10, we might get 7, 6. But this statement says we will get less revenues from the dollar, which is how I interpret this phrase and try to get clarity on, would mean we'd have to use less than 10% of the total, demand would have to go down by more than 90% in order for the Crown to get less revenue. So it's a math question that tripped me up. I tried to get clarity on.
are you saying it's not always a direct one-to-one relationship?
It's not always a one-to-one relationship. That's true.
Okay.
And what I believe, well, it's possible that what was being referenced here is an attempt to say, gee, if you increase it to 10, you can't assume demand stays the same. Demand's going to go down. We talked about that. That's certainly true, but that's not how I read these specific words.
so let me get this straight. The offset you're talking about is if the price goes up, you receive more revenues, but that reduces demand, so it kind of offsets. Is that what you're referring to?
There's offsetting that goes on in order for there to be less revenue, net revenue to the Crown. If the price goes up by 10, we have to cut the demand by over 90%. We have to cut, one out of almost no demand's left. as a matter of math. If it's helpful to work through it, a math example, I would.
Great, thank you. And my friend, Mr. Bass, took you to a slide and your report. If we can turn up slide 39 from your demonstrative. Clear this up for us. You have that in front of you, sir?
I do.
Okay, I believe it took you to the first sub-bullet, which reads, excess profits are not earned, comma, however, comma, because electricity prices do not reflect rents due to the domination by HEPCO/Ontario Hydro. And then you have sites there, which he took you to your paragraphs. I don't know if you need to look those up or not, about the history of HEPCO Ontario. Do you recall that?
Yes.
So when you cited these paragraphs, what is that relating to?
That's relating to the fact that HEPCO is a non-for-profit and the others are for-profit enterprises. And it also reflects the fact that HEPCO charges prices that don't reflect rents in the first place. I mean, don't reflect the water rental rates because they're not paying it, but they're also have below market price cost of capital. So their prices that they charge are below the normal profit level of prices as a result of structure in Ontario.
I see. Those are my questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamel.
Now let me properly thank you, sir. Thank you for your contribution to this case. Through your reports, the requests to redact throughout, and we all know that there was a cost to coming to give evidence and to sitting in that chair and responding to the questions. And so particularly, I thank you for the respect that you have shown this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my honor. Thank you.
So we're done for the day and we can go off record.